Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing another chapter by Sandel in Sandel's wonderful book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do? We'll be discussing chapter 3 on libertarianism. So let us begin. So at the heart of libertarianism is the defending of freedom, individual freedom or individual liberties. So a good slogan is give me liberty or give me death. The hardcore defender of, proponent of libertarianism thinks that in some deep sense, it is respecting freedom, individual freedoms, that trumps everything else. Every other ethical consideration ultimately must be deemed secondary to the importance of respecting human freedom. And here's what follows from that thought. I mean, respecting freedom is, of course, acceptable, morally worthwhile. Libertarianism make it like the ultimate moral value. And here's what happens. Here are the consequences of taking freedom as the sole or the main or the most important value in morality and politics. So the first thing that follows, and libertarians gladly endorse this, is proponing a free market. In a free market is defined as interaction or a setting in which people buy and exchange goods and services for an agreed upon price with no government intervention. That's the crucial part. Any market that involves government regulations is by definition not free, or at least not free to that extent. The more regulations, the less free, the less regulation, the more free. And the thought is it diminishes the freedom precisely because it adds conditions to a market exchange that go above and beyond what the individual participant in the transaction are willing to or had intended. The free market, the pure free market, is one in which it is only the individual decisions of the people making the transaction that matter. An employer, for example, might propose or offer to pay someone $10 per hour, and that person might be willing to accept $10 per hour in exchange of whatever labor the person is going to do. And a free market is one in which the employment relationship holds purely in terms of the voluntary action of the employer and the employee. That's it. There are no other constraints like minimum wage laws, regulations, safety laws, and the way in which the employer must be treated, the conditions that must be made for the employee, and things like that. It's only what the employee and employer are willing voluntarily, freely to do. And that's the ultimate standard for a free market. Proponents of libertarianism think that what follows from this conception of freedom is a very limited conception of the state, that the good society is one in which the sphere of authority of the state is very limited, is very small. And they call that the minimal state. And the minimal state only has jurisdiction, only has power over the following kinds of activities: enforcing contracts, protecting property, and maintaining the peace. So it's a kind of police only government. The government should only interfere in the free market and people's interaction with each other to enforce contracts when someone refuses to comply with a previously agreed upon contract, when someone steals, protect property, or when someone commits a crime, to intervene and send someone to prison and so on. But those are the only legitimate activities of the government within society. Why those? Well, they argue that those are the only ones that are compatible with individual freedom. And individual freedom is the ultimate kind of value must be enshrined in a good society. And only the minimal state is compatible with that. So here are some of the things that also are internal to libertarian politics. In one item is called non-paternalism. And that's the claim that government should not be in the business of protecting citizens from themselves. If a government issues or puts forth an anti-prostitution law, for example, that's violating individual freedom, provided that the prostitute and the client are both willing to engage in that kind of activity. One is willing to pay for sexual favors. The other one is willing to give sexual favors for the sake of the money. That's a voluntary, free exchange in the marketplace for a kind of service, namely sexual service. And a minimal state has no business outlining that, enacting any regulations against that. That's a kind of paternalism. paternalism from pater, father. It's like treating citizens as though they're children of the state, and the state, the government, is the father who's making them behave well. From the libertarian perspective, the state has no business governing how individuals manage their own lives. If someone wants to engage in prostitution and there's someone who wants to be a prostitute, as long as there's no coercion or deception going on, people are free to do so. In the just society is one in which that's respected and allowed. And the same goes for drugs. Drugs are self-harming, right? People that use drugs harm themselves. But in the typical case, they choose voluntarily to take the drugs. The person that's selling them the drug chooses voluntarily to give them the drug in exchange for money. From the libertarian perspective, when freedom is paramount, the fact that these people are hurting themselves by the use of drug is just not good enough to undermine individual freedom. Individual freedom trumps people's willingness to do self-harm. And because that's the case, they argue, no government should be in the business of outlawing those kinds of activities. Anti-prostitution laws, anti-drug laws, and so on should not be allowed. The government has no authority to enact those things. It's up to individuals to choose for themselves what to do with their lives. And related to that is the no moral legislation. The thought is that government should not be in the business of imposing any kind of morality onto others. For example, non-discrimination laws. If an employer refuses to hire someone, a white employer refuses to hire someone because they're Black, they're perfectly qualified for the job, but the employer just does not like Black people. Our contemporary society has anti-discrimination laws. Most of us say, yeah, wonderful, we should have anti-discrimination laws. Stop being, racist, that's bad. It follows from the libertarian assumptions about individual freedom that the government has no authority to impose those anti-discrimination laws. Why? Because it would be constraining or imposing limits upon the individual freedom of the employer in this particular case. So a lot of actual libertarians feel uncomfortable with this implication, but it seems to follow from their assumptions. And likewise, anti-price gouging laws, that a supplier of necessities charges 10 times as much during a time of calamity. Most of us think something went wrong, that there's an abuse of the freedom. But it seems to follow from the libertarian conception of a just state that there should be no government regulation of that. There's just people choosing to sell products for a high price and people choosing to buy those products. So to legislate against that is to impose limits on the free market, and it's to legislate morally. At least that's a typical way of thinking. Importantly, libertarians do champion this. This follows from their view, and they're by and large adamant in defending this. No redistribution of wealth. There are and within a society, there are people that need more money, that are poor, that are struggling. There are people that have an abundance of wealth, they have way more than they would ever need. In some states, tax the wealthy so they can give some to the poor for the sake of maximizing welfare. So here's something crucial comes to the fore. If you remember the first time I introduced libertarianism, the typical libertarian defense is that it's based on two claims. One is that the free market is the way of maximizing welfare. If you want to maximize economic prosperity, you let the free market run. But it turns out that's only partly true, only some context. Sometimes the way of maximizing prosperity is precisely by taxing the wealthy. That is the justification for taxing the wealthy. That the amount of wealth, the extra amount of wealth that some people have, is way beyond anything that makes an impact in their actual happiness. But that very amount of wealth will go a long way towards promoting the happiness of others. So in the name of maximization of wealth, maximization of prosperity or well-being, governments take from the wealthy and give to the poor, like Robin Hood. Libertarians give up on that claim. Typically, anyway, give up on the claim that the free market maximizes welfare. They say, well, fair enough. Sometimes it doesn't, many times it doesn't. But it's still the second claim, the main ground for defending libertarianism becomes individual freedom. And the position of the libertarians is that even though it does not promote more happiness, even though redistributing the wealth would be good for most people, as those receiving the money, it should still not be allowed because doing so violates the rights of the wealthy. In other words, the individual rights to do with their property as they wish and their individual freedom trumps the goodness that will be brought about, the prosperity will be brought about by society as a whole. So libertarians willingly accept the following conclusion for their theory. A just society need not be one in which people are happy. A just society need not be one that is even trying to maximize happiness or well-being, economic well-being. It's just one that respects individual freedom, even at the expense of a lot of people being miserable. One of the basic ideas for founding a just society, namely promoting happiness, is just abandoned by libertarians when it clashes with individual freedom. Individual freedom takes priority over maximization of happiness, they claim. And by far the most plausible defense of libertarianism, you might find libertarianism plausible. A lot of people don't. A lot of people think it's morally callous and distant, and like morality is not the right way of describing it. It's something else. But the best moral defense for the view is something like the following. It's grounded in an example, but you see how it generalizes. So it's the Michael Jordan's money example. So imagine a society in which there is a fair, a just distribution of wealth. Whatever your conception of just distribution of wealth is, if it is equal for everyone or proportionate to talent, whatever fairness amounts to, imagine a society that has that. So starting point of the thought experiment, there's a just distribution of wealth of that society. That's the first main claim. Now, suppose that Michael Jordan is a participant of that society. Suppose that he's a great basketball player, the best of in human history, perhaps, and that he notices that he notices that when people go to watch games that he's in, they go largely to watch him play. So he tells the organizers of the events, here's my deal, I'm going to stop playing unless I get half of the revenue for all of these events. Half the money coming in has to go directly to my pocket, or I'm not going to do any more games. And now the organizers think, well, if you don't show up, a lot of people are not going to show up, and they ended up accepting the deal. The organizers of these events agree to give half the money that comes, half the revenue off the top, directly into Michael Jordan's pockets. And everyone knows this. Everyone in society knows that he's made this deal, and that if they go half the money of their ticket, it's going to go directly to Michael Jordan, and the other half is going to be distributed amongst everyone else that is working there, and everywhere else where the money has to go to keep the event running. And people choose to go anyway. People voluntarily go and pay to make Michael Jordan obscenely wealthy very quickly. Here's the question for us. Is Michael Jordan entitled to that money? Should a good society permit him to keep that amount of money given that way of getting it? Would taxing him afterwards to give to the poor be compatible with respecting his rights? Should a good society tax him either way? Should good society maximize happiness by taking money from the super wealthy Michael Jordan to give to those that are starving to death? Those are the questions before us, or those are serious political questions. Here is the libertarian response. Because people voluntarily chose to go to the game knowing perfectly well where the money was going to go to, namely half of it to Michael Jordan. He is entitled to the money. The original distribution of wealth in the society was fair, was just. People voluntarily chose to give some of that money to Michael Jordan, a large part of that money to Michael Jordan, knowingly, willingly, for the sake of watching his people playing the game. So Michael Jordan, should keep the money, no taxation, at least not for distributing to other people. That is the fair thing to do, say the libertarians. Here's some objections. So anyway, that's the most plausible argument for having wealthy people keep their wealth. People voluntarily choose to engage in activities like going to games that result in some people making a lot of money. In people that make those decisions know that. So therefore, the people that make a lot of money are entitled to it. There should be no taxation. That's their money. People voluntarily choose to engage in activities that led to that, willingly, voluntarily, in the free market, and that should be respected. Individual freedom trumps or undermines the happiness that will come about by redistributing the wealth. That's the basic argument. Here's some objections. Here's some objections to that way of thinking. The first one is that it's not obvious by any means that individual freedom is more important than happiness. Put differently, poor people in need who are starving to death need the money a lot more than Michael Jordan does. He has an extreme amount of wealth. He would not even notice what is missing, and yet people would be able to eat and have a shelter and things like that. So obviously, a lot more happiness will come about by redistributing the wealth, by taxing Michael Jordan. That is morally relevant, and the individual freedom that he has to do with whatever he wishes with his wealth is just not weighty enough to outweigh the happiness of a lot of people. That's just miscalculating, misassessing what's more valuable, morally speaking. That's objection number one. Objection number two, Jordan does not play alone. Even if one is willing to grant that there should be income inequality, it's the most plausible argument for income inequality is one that tracks like intelligence, hard work, talent, and things like that. People that work harder, that have more, they're more talented, should be making more, roughly proportionate to how much more intelligent, more talented, how much more they work. But that's not what's happening in this case. The deal that Michael Jordan made is not tracking his talent. He himself does not have half the talent if you put together everyone else in the teams and all the teams and everyone's involved in the games. He does not have that much talent. I mean, it's just not tracking that. Though put differently, he does not play alone. The product, the game that you see, is the result of the work of many people, not just him, or at least half of it is not him. So the deal did not track he's getting half the money, did not track his actual contribution to the enterprise. The free market does not track talent and intelligence. And that seems to be problematic. It seems that people should get paid roughly proportionate to how much talent they have and how much hard work they put into it, not merely by the voluntary decisions that other people make. So Jordan's keeping all the money ignores the fact, undermines the fact that a lot of other people are involved in the bringing about of that money. It's not just him. He's the tiny factor in the whole system. Objection number three, Jordan is not really taxed against his consent by being a member of society, but he tacitly consents to obeying the law. By being a member of society and taking advantage of those that build the stadiums, those that build the roads, those that protect the society, those that develop the games for the rules for the basketball games, the trainers in his past that help him develop his skills. He's just embedded in this society that enabled him to develop his talents, and his very ability to play depends upon this whole context, this whole society. In his being a participant of that context, of that society, arguably entails that he has tacitly agreed to play by the rules. And one of the major rules is that people should follow the law. And if there's a law that says, hey, let's take from the wealthy to give to the poor, he has tacitly consented to agreeing to laws provided they're fair. So he has in a way tacitly consented to following the law provided the law is fair. So it's not against his will taking his money, at least not exactly against his will. Four, it seems vicious, immoral. There's something deficient about one's character if one is willing to allow thousands of people to starve to death so that we can enjoy a great amount of wealth, but way more than what we can possibly need. So there seems to be something defective in the character of those that refuse to share their wealth with those that are starving to death. In a society that permits that, it's enshrining, it's promoting vice. And that is morally relevant. A good society shouldn't enshrine and promote vice. It should do the opposite. It should promote virtue. It should create friendships. It should create good communities. And should create conditions in which virtue can advance, not the opposite, not vice. Finally, let's ask, how far does respect in individual freedom go? How far can a good society go while respecting freedom? Libertarians say all the way. That's the thing that trumps everything else. But should a good society permit people selling their kidneys, right? If someone says, hey, I want an extra $10,000 to have 2 kidneys, I can live with 1. Someone else says, hey, I need a kidney, I'll give you $10,000, give it to me. Would a good society respect that kind of transaction? Is something being lost by permitting that? How about the example I gave before, prostitution? Someone willing to sell their sexual favors, someone willing to pay for someone else's sexual favors. Is that the mark of a good society, respecting, allowing people to do that? How about selling space or renting one's womb? How about selling your children? Things like that. If people are willing to accept the transaction, would a good society permit all of this? Is that the mark of a good society or a bad society? Most people want to say something has gone wrong here. This is a bad society, not a good society. And libertarianism leads that way. So that's so much the worse for libertarianism. And here's a particularly dark example. How about consensual cannibalism? How about if 2 people, like Sandel describes an actual historical case of a couple that advertised in a newspaper saying, hey, we want to eat someone. If you want to volunteer, please come schedule an appointment. We can interview to see if we're going to eat you. And people thought it was a joke. A lot of people thought it was a joke. But a lot of people showed up for the interview. And one person agreed to, chose to be eaten by this couple. And of course, some people didn't like that transaction a lot, and they called the police, and they went to trial and so on. And the defense of the lawyer was the state has no business intervening in this transaction between individuals that have, full consent, have used their freedom. 2 people have chosen to eat someone else. The person who's being eaten has chosen to let himself be eaten. That's the transaction between consenting adults. A good society has no business interfering with that. Consensual cannibalism follows from the taking individual freedom as the sole standard, the main standard, the Trumpian standard for morality. And the question for those that are tempted by libertarianism is this true? Are these consequences moral, justifiable? Are those the mark of a good society? Most people want to say, oh, no, something has gone very wrong. In abandoning other moral considerations for the sake of individual freedom, these consequences follow and they're not good. Those are the mark of a bad society, not a good society. Okay, well, let us end there. I'll see you next time.